Hey guys, how's it going? Welcome back to the channel, and today we are going to be talking about what era of comedy is the greatest and reigns supreme over the rest. And the winner is the 90s! Yay! Alright, that's going to do it for today's video. No, I'm kidding. Actually, what we're doing today is talking about why I think the 90s was the best decade for the comedy genre. I'm going to be going over two topics that define what makes a good comedy. The other thing I'm going to be talking about is the other decades of comedy, like the 60s, 70s, 80s, and the 21st century of comedies. Discussing what made those in this decade good, but what also made them fall off and worse compared to the others. Oh, do you hear that? It's the opinion warning! Yay! Once again, I'll be mentioning that this video has a lot of my opinion in it, and if you don't agree, please don't be salty. Alright, let us continue. So starting off, I want to talk about writing, which is part one of what makes a good comedy. It's no secret that the writing was one of the keystones to the 90s' great success in the comedy genre. Movies like Joe Dirt, Dumb and Dumber, and Ace Ventura were all very successful, and the jokes and the script writing were all major parts of it. A lot of the jokes you see in newer comedies like Anchorman or Central Intelligence are based on the actor's ability to improv and do things on the fly. This type of comedy is very popular in today's movies, unlike in the 90s where writing the jokes would involve a group of writers and the main actor writing them together. While people are allowed to have their opinions on which form of comedy is better, it still has to be said that when applied in the film, the jokes made in the older films seemed a lot more planned out. But to make a point for the other side, though, the jokes that are made in today's films seem more natural and flow better because they come straight from the actor. This is more my thoughts on it, but after watching some online clips and doing some reading online about the writers from films like Austin Powers and The Mask, each generation of films, whatever genre, has its own little personality to it that separates it from the other. To more specifically point it out, in the 90s, I can see a common theme of goofiness within each film, whether it's acting like a crazy green masked superhero or a dumb redneck. The common theme is simply acting goofy and cracking one-liners. In today's world, you have to be way more careful with your humor, so in today's comedies, the humor is a lot safer and feels bland. Lots of millennial writers in comedy today look back at the 90s as the golden era, and that era has inspired them greatly, especially something like SNL and the great comedians that have come from it. Now, just to specifically point it out, a list of comedians that have come from SNL that they were big in the 90s include Adam Sandler, Chris Rock, David Spade, Kevin James, Jim Carrey, and many more. And even to this day, SNL has given us such amazing comedians like Pete Davidson. Now, after doing my research on late night TV shows in SNL, of course, I have a new appreciation for them. Not only are they a platform for new artists in the world to express themselves and make it big, it's also a place where people can sit down and enjoy some good comedy while keeping up with current events. Some of the best writers in film during the 90s include Tim Hurley, who was a well-known writer for Adam Sandler's greatest films like Happy Gilmore, Bedtime Stories, and even Waterboy. He was also one of the screenwriters for SNL skits in the 90s as well. His most recent work was on the film Pixels, starring Adam Sandler and Kevin James, which, let's just say that it wasn't one of his best moments. God, that movie sucked. Anyway, another great writer who is a man named Kevin Smith, who some of his major accomplishments include Chasing Amy, Dogma, and also Clerks. But not only is he a writer, he also has acted in several films and directed as well. Now, this well-rounded, talented entertainer is a great representation of what the 90s has given us. Now, probably the biggest name out of the writers I have talked about so far is a writer that was able to convince people in the 90s to upgrade their home security. This writer is John Hughes. Now, his most successful movies in the 90s include Home Alone, which it's the home security joke. If you didn't get it, I'm sorry if it was bad. Uncle Buck, Flubber, Baby's Day Out, and Dennis the Menace. The movie adaptation, of course. He didn't write the comics. As the man who wrote Ferris Bueller's Day Off, he had a lot to live up to entering into the 90s, and boy did he deliver, working with great actors like Robin Williams, Macaulay Culkin, and John Candy. Alright, moving on. The next category I want to talk about is actors, which is part two of what makes a good comedy, in my opinion. Now, while on the surface, comedy is such a happy and fun form of entertainment, it usually comes from a dark past or a rough childhood. A great example of this is an actor named Jim Carrey. Jim Carrey is one of the most well-known comedians coming from large amounts of fame in the 90s from films like The Mask, Dumb and Dumber, and Ace Ventura: Pet Detective. Now, Jim Carrey is what I would describe as a physical actor. What this means is he makes jokes by performing goofy actions, or moves oddly, like wacky, do wacky, make and this making anyone chuckle or at least smirk. Now, what a lot of people don't know is when he was a kid, his family was extremely poor and at one point lived in a station wagon. A lot of his early stand-up jokes derive from these problems, which goes back to what I was talking about, that comedy comes from dark places. Jim Carrey, after his great success in the 90s, took a long break from Hollywood and focused on himself to find out who he really was, later returning to star as the main villain in the Sonic adaptation movie known as Dr. Egghead. Now, alright, listen. I know this next actor is controversial for being either really good in some people's eyes or really overrated in others, but you gotta give credit where credit's due. Adam Sandler is one of the biggest comedians of all time, and has a whole list of classic comedies from the 90s that influenced 90s pop culture heavily, and still influences young comedians today. Now, what makes Adam Sandler so great is his sense of humor and his ability to connect with people in the audience with his host of different characters, seep deeply with core values, and teaches you life lessons through his comedy and stories. I would consider his two greatest films during the 90s to be Happy Gilmore and Big Daddy. Reason being, these two films both represent what I believe Adam Sandler is truly about, which, going back to what I said earlier, is making people laugh and giving them a character they can relate to. He feels and shows that he's not just Joe Hollywood. He doesn't change on and off camera. He is just a regular guy with the ability to make people laugh. With a lot of big comedian actors of today, they are way more business-oriented or have just gone full Hollywood, like Kevin Hart, business-oriented, or Dwayne Johnson, who has gone super Hollywood. Now, this next actor I want to talk about isn't really a comedian, but he starred in a classic Christmas comedy. This being Macaulay Culkin. He is one of the best examples of child superstar, as he was the leading kid in the Christmas classic Home Alone. Now, like most child actors, Culkin didn't have a childhood due to his constant media attention, forceful and abusive parents, and the fear of disappointing the people around him. Culkin was also infamous in movies as a child, like Uncle Buck, My Girl, and recently he was an adult guest star in Zoolander. That wasn't really recent, but it's like his most recent work. But now, in today's time, though, Culkin has taken a large break from the film industry to focus on himself and his artwork. But I've heard that he's going to be guest starring in American Horror Story, which should be really good. Now, the last thing I want to talk about today is the other decades of comedy, starting off with the 60s. Now, the 60s, in my opinion, was one of the strongest times for sitcoms and theater shows. I know that Seinfeld and Friends were a lot later than then, which people would consider one of the best sitcoms of all time. But listen, nothing compares to what came out of the 60s. Now, this was also during a time of great civil action with black rights movements and women's rights movements. People would see in films and sitcoms women making slight remarks of being a housewife and making jokes that poked fun at the American civil rights. Now, the reason why I say the 60s were a weaker time, though, is because of everything that was going on during then. Nobody really had the time to visit these shows or watch comedies because of everything that was going around them with all the civil rights actions. Now, talking about my next one, the 70s and 80s were a time of classic comedy traditions to be born, whether it was rom-coms, family comedies, or just straight-up weird movies like Howard the Duck. Ugh, that thing gives me nightmares. Now, the 70s and 80s built the foundation of what makes a true classic comedy, with many films having pretty simple plots like The Great Outdoors or Uncle Buck. Being as it may, though, these 2 decades have many plot holes in them, in their films. They also have many similarities in both what made them good and bad, which is why I am putting them together. They are really similar. Many of these movies, while being funny, were very lackluster and not much fun to watch more than once. And like going back on what I said earlier about the films being really simple, that comes as a double-edged sword. Um, because while yes, the simplicity made them easy to understand, it also made them uninteresting watching them more than once, and didn't really give them the repetitiveness that you see in a lot of other comedies. Okay, now this is a big claim here, and I may be out of line with this one, but I believe today's comedies are trying way too hard to be funny, which ironically is making them unfunny. Like the movie Get Hard. Like, there was no reason to put Kevin Hart and Will Ferrell together, but they did anyway. Why? I don't know. Money? Ah, of course. I hate this. Anyway, another thing to talk about during this 21st century is, of course, cancel culture. Because everyone loves that, right? Right? Now, cancel culture is at an all-time high, and comedians are finding it harder and harder to make their form of humor and not be backlashed by social media and all the Karens of the world. Comedians had the creative freedom to make jokes that pushed boundaries but were still in good taste before cancel culture became so mainstream. In today's comedies, you just see stale jokes that are bland or just aren't funny in general. This is in no way anybody's fault but ourselves for allowing something like cancel culture to become as big as it is today. All right, those are the reasons why I believe that 90s are a superior decade when it comes to the comedy genre compared to all the other decades. So that's going to do it for today's video. I hope you enjoyed. Please let me know in the comments what decade you thought had the best comedy movies. Right now, I don't have a solid idea of what I'm going to be doing for next week's video, but I'll probably involve an actor and why I think they are so great and why I love them so much and how I want to kiss them and smooch them. Anyway, I'll see you next time. Peace.